"Sir, you cannot stand there." The voice came firm but not loud, carried by discipline more than emotion, and still, it passed through the morning air without ever truly landing. Because the man it was meant for did not move, did not turn, did not even acknowledge that it had been said, as if the words belonged to a different place, a different moment, one that no longer applied to him. Walter Hayes stood just beyond the row of white folding chairs set aside for invited guests, his figure slightly hunched but steady, hands resting lightly on the brim of a worn cap he held in front of him, the fabric of his old suit catching the pale sunlight in uneven shades, pressed once long ago but now softened by time. While around him the base moved with quiet precision, soldiers adjusting their positions, officers checking lists, a low murmur of coordination flowing beneath the distant sound of a military band warming up somewhere beyond the ceremony platform. And still, no one stopped for him. No one asked his name. No one questioned why he stood there alone at the edge of something clearly not meant for him. They simply moved around him, past him, through him, as if he were part of the background, something fixed and unimportant, like the metal barricades or the flag stands set along the perimeter. And that was what made it different, what made it heavier than a direct insult, because it was not rejection. It was absence, the quiet certainty that he did not belong enough to even be addressed. A pair of younger soldiers passed within a few feet, one of them glancing briefly at Walter's shoes, scuffed leather that had seen years no one here could measure, before looking away just as quickly, their conversation continuing without interruption, while an officer in dress uniform stepped around him with a polite but distant nod that never reached the eyes, already focused on something else, someone else, a name that existed on a list somewhere, and Walter did not react to any of it, his gaze fixed instead on the raised platform ahead where the ceremony would soon begin, where rows of chairs sat waiting, where the flag hung at half-mast against a sky too clear for the weight it carried. And there was something in the way he watched it, not like a spectator, not like someone curious or unsure, but like someone remembering, measuring the distance between what was and what had been, and finding it smaller than it should have been. The breeze shifted slightly, moving across the open ground and brushing against his jacket, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of equipment and the low, steady rhythm of boots on concrete. And Walter adjusted his grip on the cap just enough to steady it, his fingers rough, deliberate, familiar with small motions that did not draw attention. And still, no one spoke to him again. No one asked if he needed help or direction, because in their eyes, there was nothing to resolve, nothing to question. He was simply an old man standing in the wrong place, and the system would correct itself in time. But Walter Hayes did not step away. He did not look for guidance or shift toward the public area. He simply remained where he was, quiet, composed, as if the line that separated him from the ceremony was not something he needed to cross, but something he had already crossed a long time ago, long before any of the names being checked or seats being filled had ever mattered. Captain Ethan Cole noticed him the second time he passed that section of the line, not because the old man had moved or spoken, but because he had not, because in a place where everything operated on motion and instruction, stillness stood out more than disruption, and Cole slowed just enough to take a proper look, his eyes scanning the details the way he had been trained to, posture first, then clothing, then placement, and what he saw did not fit the pattern, not the clean lines of dress. Uniforms, not the designated seating, not the controlled flow of authorized personnel, just an elderly man in a worn suit standing where no one without clearance should be standing, holding a cap in both hands like it belonged to a different era entirely. Cole adjusted the folder tucked under his arm, the printed list of names and assigned seating already committed to memory, and stepped toward Walter Hayes with the measured confidence of someone who trusted the system he represented. "Sir," he said, his tone respectful but firm, the kind that carried authority without needing to raise itself. "This area is reserved for invited guests and designated personnel." Walter turned his head slightly, not in surprise, not in resistance, just enough to acknowledge the voice, his eyes settling on Cole with a calm that felt out of place against the structure surrounding them. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with the distant sound of the band aligning its first notes and the soft rustle of uniforms adjusting into formation. You will need to move to the public section just beyond the barricade. Cole continued, gesturing subtly toward the open area farther back, where a handful of civilians had already gathered, their posture less rigid, their presence clearly separate from the ceremony itself, and Walter followed the direction of the gesture with his eyes, taking in the distance without any visible reaction, as if he had already known exactly where that line was drawn. I understand, Walter said quietly, his voice even, without protest, without hesitation, and that should have been the end of it, a simple correction, a routine adjustment, but something in the way he said it lingered, not defiance, not reluctance, just acceptance that carried a weight Cole could not immediately place, and it unsettled him just enough to tighten his posture, to reinforce the boundary he had already established. We need to keep this area clear for protocol, Cole added, more to reassert the structure than to clarify it, because the situation did not require explanation, it required compliance, and Walter gave a small nod, the movement almost imperceptible, before shifting his stance, stepping back exactly one pace, then another, not hurried, not reluctant, just measured, as if each step had been decided long before the instruction was given. The ground beneath his shoes made a soft, dry sound against the concrete, barely noticeable under the growing cadence of the ceremony preparations. And when he stopped, he was just beyond the invisible line, no longer part of the arrangement, no longer within the space that mattered, and Cole watched him for a moment longer than necessary, ensuring the correction held, before turning back toward his duties, his attention already moving on to the next detail, the next name, the next position that needed to be exactly where it belonged, because that was how order was maintained, how meaning was preserved, and behind him, Walter Hayes remained where he had been placed, just outside the frame of importance, his gaze returning to the ceremony platform as if nothing had changed at all. The ceremony began to take shape with quiet precision, the kind that did not need to be announced because every person present already knew their role. The first notes of the military band rising slowly across the open ground, steady and controlled, drawing attention forward toward the platform where officers had begun to take their positions, their movements synchronized, deliberate, and behind them the flag hung still for a moment before the wind caught it again, lifting its edges just enough to remind everyone why they were there, and Walter Hayes stood beyond the line, exactly where he had been placed, the distance between him and the front no more than 20 feet, but it might as well have been a mile, not because of space, but because of recognition, because of who was seen and who was not. A group of guests moved into the front row, their names checked against the list Captain Ethan Cole carried, each one acknowledged, each one guided into place with quiet respect, and Cole moved among them with confidence, his voice low, his posture exact, ensuring that every detail aligned with the expectations set long before the ceremony had begun. And as he passed once more near the outer edge, his gaze flickered briefly toward Walter, not out of concern, but out of habit, confirming that the boundary he had established remained intact. And it did, the old man still standing where he had been directed, not attempting to move forward, not seeking attention, just present in a way that felt both solid and strangely distant at the same time. Two civilians behind Walter spoke quietly to each other, one of them gesturing toward the front with mild curiosity, the other shrugging, their attention already drifting elsewhere, because nothing about the old man suggested urgency or importance, nothing that would pull focus away from the ceremony itself, and that was how it held, that was how he remained. Part of the scene, but not part of the moment, visible but unrecognized. Walter adjusted his grip on the cap in his hands, the motion small, controlled, his fingers brushing against the inside lining where the fabric had worn thin over years of use, and for a brief second, his thumb paused against something tucked just beneath the fold, something solid, familiar, and he shifted the cap slightly, revealing the edge of a small, worn coin resting inside, its surface dulled by time, its markings softened into something that only memory could fully read, and he held it there, not displaying it, not hiding it, just allowing it to exist in the quiet space between his hands, while the band's music grew fuller, more defined, and the first speaker stepped to the podium, the sound of a microphone adjusting cutting lightly through the air before settling into clarity. Captain Cole turned toward the platform, his attention fully reclaimed by the structure of the event, the sequence of introductions, the order of recognition, the names that would be spoken aloud, each one carrying weight because it had been documented, confirmed, placed within the system that gave it meaning. And as the opening remarks began, Walter's eyes remained fixed forward, not on the speaker, not on the crowd, but somewhere just beyond them, as if listening for something else entirely, something not written into the program. And when the first name was read, a subtle shift passed through him, not visible enough for anyone nearby to notice, just a tightening of his fingers around the coin. A breath held a fraction longer than before, as if the sound had reached deeper than it should have, touching a place no one else there could see, while around him. The ceremony continued exactly as planned, each moment unfolding with precision, each name acknowledged in its proper place. And still, Walter Hayes stood just outside of it all, carrying something that did not need to be announced to be real. The name being read from the podium carried across the field with measured clarity, each syllable landing in its place, each pause intentional, and Walter Hayes did not blink as it echoed through him, not because he was unmoved, but because he had already felt it before the sound reached his ears, the weight of it, the shape of it, the memory tied to it tightening quietly beneath his ribs, and his fingers pressed slightly harder against the worn coin resting inside his cap, the edge of it, familiar against his skin, grounding him in a way nothing else in that moment could, while around him the audience responded as expected, heads dipping, shoulders straightening, a ripple of formal respect passing through the rows in front. But none of it reached him in the same way, because for them the name was part of a program, part of a list, and for him it was something else entirely. A gust of wind moved across the ceremony ground, lifting the flag again, and carrying with it the faint scent of heated metal and dust, a scent that did not belong to this quiet base, but found him anyway, threading through the present like something unfinished. And for a brief second, the edges of the world softened, the neat lines of chairs and uniforms blurring just enough to let something older press through, not fully formed, not yet a memory, just a feeling, a shift in air and sound that made his posture tighten almost imperceptibly, as if his body recognized something his surroundings did not. And then it passed, leaving him exactly where he stood, the coin still in his hand, the ceremony still unfolding without interruption. Captain Ethan Cole remained focused on the structure ahead, his attention locked onto the sequence of events, the timing of each speaker, the alignment of each movement. And yet even he felt a faint disruption he could not quite place, not in the ceremony itself, which continued flawlessly, but in the periphery, in the sense that something just outside the planned arrangement carried more weight than it should have. And his gaze flickered once more toward Walter, just long enough to register that the old man had not moved, had not reacted in any visible way, and still stood with that same quiet presence that refused to align with the role he had been assigned. And it unsettled him in a way he could not explain, because there was no rule being broken, no boundary being crossed, and yet something about it felt unresolved. A staff sergeant positioned near the rear of the formation, Owen Carter, had been watching from the edge of the line, his attention divided between his assigned post and the small irregularities that experience had taught him not to ignore, and Walter Hayes had become one of those irregularities, not because of what he did, but because of what he did not do, the absence of uncertainty, the lack of hesitation, the way he stood during the reading of names, not shifting, not adjusting, not reacting late or early, but matching the rhythm of the ceremony with a precision that did not come from observation, but from familiarity. And Carter's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the details, the worn suit, the old cap, the coin barely visible within it. And something about the combination did not add up, not in a way he could articulate, but in a way he could feel. A quiet signal that this man did not belong to the group behind the barricade any more than he belonged to the front row. And that realization settled into him with a weight that demanded attention. The band's music softened as the speaker paused, the next name waiting just beyond the silence. And in that brief space, Walter's thumb moved across the surface of the coin, tracing a pattern worn smooth by years no one here had witnessed, and his gaze remained forward, steady, as if the distance between where he stood and where he had once stood was not measured in feet, but in something far more difficult to cross, while around him the ceremony continued to hold its shape, unaware that just beyond its edge, something far older and far heavier was beginning to rise into the moment. The next name was spoken, slower this time, each syllable given space as if the weight behind it required more than just sound, and Walter Hayes felt it before he fully heard it, the cadence familiar in a way that bypassed thought entirely, settling into him like something returning rather than arriving, and his grip on the coin tightened just enough to steady the shift that followed, because the present had begun to loosen its hold. Not completely, not enough to take him away from where he stood, but enough to let something else rise alongside it. Something older, something carried in fragments that did not need to be assembled to be understood. And for a moment the clean lines of the ceremony blurred at the edges, the white chairs, the pressed uniforms, the polished order giving way to a different kind of structure, one built from instinct and memory rather than protocol. And the air changed first, thickening slightly, carrying a faint hum that did not belong to the quiet bass, but felt unmistakably real, the kind of low vibration that traveled through the ground and up through the body, steady and constant, and Walter's posture adjusted without conscious thought, shoulders aligning, weight shifting just enough to anchor him as if he were standing somewhere else entirely. The coin pressed into his palm became more than an object. It became a point of contact, a fixed place between past and present, and the sound of the band dissolved into something deeper, a distant rhythm that echoed differently, less precise, more urgent, and then the image formed, not as a full scene, but as a sequence of sensations, the glow of dim light against metal surfaces, the movement of figures in tight spaces, voices controlled but carrying an edge that came from knowing time was limited, and in the center of it, a younger version of Walter moved with the same quiet certainty, guiding rather than commanding, steady rather than loud, his presence anchoring those around him without needing to explain why, and beside him, a young officer, not yet carrying rank with the same weight, not yet shaped by the years that would follow, relied on that steadiness without fully understanding it, trusting something he could not name because in that moment, it was enough. The memory did not unfold in detail. It did not need to. It existed in fragments that carried more truth than any full account could, a hand reaching out, a voice kept low, a path chosen without hesitation, and then the moment that mattered, quiet, almost unremarkable in its simplicity. The officer pressing something small into Walter's hand, not as a reward, not as a formal gesture, but as acknowledgement, a recognition that passed between them without needing witnesses, and the coin settled there, its weight insignificant to anyone else, but fixed in meaning for the one who received it. And just as quickly as it had formed, the memory receded, folding back into the present with the same quiet control it had arrived, leaving Walter standing exactly where he had been, the ceremony returning in full clarity around him, the band's music steady once more, the speaker continuing without pause. And yet something had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone nearby could point to, but internally, a line drawn between what was seen and what was known. Staff Sergeant Owen Carter felt it, even if he could not see it, the subtle change in the old man's stance, the way his shoulders settled into a position that did not belong to someone uncertain or out of place, but to someone who had stood in formations long before this one. And Carter's attention sharpened, his instincts pulling tighter as he glanced toward the command area, where senior officers would soon arrive, the pieces beginning to align in a way that made him uneasy, not because something was wrong, but because something important had not yet been recognized. And across the space, Captain Ethan Cole remained focused on the program, unaware that just beyond the boundary he had enforced, the quiet man he had moved aside carried a history that was beginning, slowly but inevitably, to surface. Staff Sergeant Owen Carter shifted his weight slightly, the subtle movement almost invisible to anyone not trained to notice it, but it marked the moment his instinct crossed into certainty, because what he was seeing no longer felt like coincidence or curiosity. It felt like something being overlooked in plain sight, and he let his gaze move again over Walter Hayes, not casually this time, but deliberately, taking in the details with a sharper focus, the way the old man held himself during the reading of names, the timing of his stillness, the absence of distraction in his eyes, and most of all, The way he reacted to specific moments in the ceremony, not broadly, not generally, but precisely, as if he already knew what was coming before it arrived. Carter's attention flicked briefly toward the command access point near the edge of the field, where the arrival of senior leadership was imminent. The security detail already shifting into position with quiet efficiency, and something about that timing pressed against his thoughts, because the alignment felt too exact, too close to be ignored, and without drawing attention, he stepped back half a pace, turning slightly, so his movement blended into the natural flow of personnel repositioning. His hand moving up toward the radio clipped at his shoulder. The channel opened with a soft click, the background noise steady but controlled, and Carter spoke low, keeping his tone even. "Control, this is Carter. I need a quick confirmation on a possible unlisted attendee near the outer boundary. Elderly male, civilian attire, name unknown." There was a pause, brief and expected, followed by a routine response asking for clarification, and Carter hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his eyes returning to Walter, then to the coin in his hand, then back to the command entry point. "No immediate issue," Carter added carefully, choosing his words with precision, "just verifying presence." The line remained open for a moment longer before the response came back. Standard protocol, no flagged individuals, no additional names beyond the registered list, and that should have settled it. That should have been the end of it, but it did not, because Carter felt the disconnect clearly now, the gap between what was recorded and what was real, and it tightened something in his chest, not alarm, not urgency, but recognition that the system he trusted did not always account for everything that mattered. He released the radio slowly, letting it rest back against his shoulder, his posture returning to its assigned position, but his attention did not shift away, not anymore, and across the space. Captain Ethan Cole continued to move along the front row, confirming placements, adjusting minor details, his focus locked onto the structure he had been tasked to maintain, unaware that just beyond his defined perimeter, something was unfolding that did not belong to any list he carried. The ceremony continued without interruption, the speaker's voice steady, the band holding its rhythm, the flag moving gently above them. And yet beneath it all, there was a subtle change in the air, a tightening, a quiet anticipation that had not been there before, as if the moment itself was waiting for something to arrive. Something not scheduled, not announced, but inevitable, and Walter Hayes stood at the center of that unseen shift, still and composed, the coin resting in his hand, his gaze fixed forward not with expectation, but with a calm that suggested he was not waiting to be recognized, only waiting for something that had already begun to return. The first sign was not sound but movement, a subtle shift near the command entry point where posture tightened and conversation stopped without being told to, and Staff Sergeant Owen Carter noticed it immediately, his gaze snapping toward the far edge of the field as a figure stepped into view, not hurried, not dramatic, but carrying a presence that altered the space around him with every step. And even before the insignia could be clearly seen, the reaction of those nearby made it unmistakable, soldiers straightening, officers turning, the natural flow of the ceremony bending slightly to accommodate something that outranked it without needing to interrupt it. Lieutenant General Marcus Whitman walked with measured precision, his uniform immaculate, his expression controlled, eyes forward, accompanied by two aides who maintained a respectful distance. And yet it was not his rank alone that drew attention. It was the way the atmosphere seemed to narrow around him, as if everything unnecessary had been quietly pushed aside, leaving only the path ahead, and Captain Ethan Cole turned as well, instinct guiding him into a formal stance as the general approached, his mind already aligning with protocol, preparing for the expected sequence of acknowledgement, greeting, continuation, and for a moment, everything remained exactly as it should have been, the ceremony intact, the structure unbroken. But then Whitman slowed, not enough to draw immediate notice from everyone, just enough to shift the rhythm, and his eyes moved, not toward the podium, not toward the front row, but past them, beyond the line that separated those who were included from those who were not. And Carter felt it again, that same tightening in the air, sharper now, more defined, as if something had just locked into place. Whitman's steps came to a complete stop, the aides behind him halting in quiet synchronization, and for a brief second, The entire scene seemed to hold its breath, the band continuing its low background cadence, the speaker's voice fading slightly under the weight of attention shifting elsewhere. And then the general turned, fully, not partially, not casually, but with deliberate intent, his gaze fixed on a single point at the edge of the gathering. And Captain Cole followed that line of sight without meaning to, his eyes landing on the one person he had already dismissed, the old man standing just beyond the boundary, unchanged, unmoving, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment without expecting it to arrive. The distance between them was not great, no more than 30 feet, but the silence that filled it stretched far wider, and Whitman took a step forward, leaving the line of protocol behind without hesitation, his boots striking the ground with a steady, unhurried rhythm, each movement carrying purpose that did not need explanation, and Carter's posture straightened instinctively, recognition dawning not from information but from instinct, while Cole remained still, his certainty beginning to fracture in a way he could not yet fully understand. Walter Hayes did not move as the general approached, did not shift his stance or adjust his position. He simply stood as he had from the beginning, the coin still resting in his hand, his gaze steady, and when Whitman came close enough to see him clearly, to take in the lines of his face, the quiet set of his shoulders, something changed in the general's expression, not visible to all, but unmistakable to those watching closely. A flicker of recognition that erased any distance between past and present in an instant, and in that moment, before a single word was spoken, the balance of the entire scene had already begun to turn. The moment held just long enough to become something more than silence, the kind that does not come from confusion, but from recognition arriving all at once. And Lieutenant General Marcus Whitman stopped within a few feet of Walter Hayes, close enough now to see every detail that time had written across his face. The lines, the stillness, the unshaken calm, and for a brief second, neither man spoke, because there was nothing uncertain left to confirm, only something to acknowledge. Whitman's eyes dropped to the coin resting in Walter's hand, its worn surface catching a thin line of light, and the change in the general's expression was immediate, subtle but absolute, the kind of shift that erased decades in a single glance. And when he looked back up, his voice did not rise, it did not need to. It carried across the space with a quiet clarity that cut through everything else. "Walter Hayes," he said, not as a question, not as a guess, but as certainty, and the effect was immediate. The air itself seeming to tighten as the name settled over the gathering, every nearby movement slowing, every conversation fading into nothing, because a name spoken like that did not belong to someone invisible. Captain Ethan Cole felt it before he understood it. The way the structure he had been holding began to slip without anything visibly breaking, his posture still rigid, his training holding him in place, but his mind racing to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had already decided, and nothing aligned, nothing fit, because the man he had moved aside moments earlier was now standing at the center of the general's full attention, and there was no protocol for that. No line on any list that explained it. Walter did not react the way anyone might have expected. He did not step forward quickly, did not try to speak first. He simply met Whitman's gaze with the same steady calm he had carried from the beginning. And in that look, something passed between them that required no audience, no explanation, just recognition layered over memory, and Whitman took one step closer, closing the remaining distance, his voice lowering slightly. "You should have been up there," he said, the words measured, not accusatory, not corrective, but weighted with something deeper than either, and Walter gave a small shake of his head, almost imperceptible. "This is where I stand," he replied quietly, and that answer, simple as it was, carried more meaning than any explanation could have, because it did not reject the offer, it did not challenge the situation. It simply reflected a truth that did not depend on position. Whitman exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, and then straightened, his posture shifting just enough to signal that what came next was no longer private. And when he spoke again, his voice carried across the entire ceremony ground with calm authority. "He stands where he has always stood," he said, and there was no need to raise it, no need to clarify, because the meaning settled immediately, reshaping the moment without force, and around them. The reaction was silent but complete, soldiers straightening further, officers holding still. The ceremony itself pausing in a way no one had planned, while Captain Cole felt the full weight of it land, not as reprimand, not as humiliation, but as realization, the kind that does not announce itself but stays, pressing quietly against everything he thought he understood, and for the first time since the morning began, the line between who belonged and who did not had been erased without argument, replaced by something far more precise, something that could not be listed or assigned, only recognized when the right person chose to speak it aloud. For a moment after the general's words settled into the air, nothing moved, not the formation, not the officers, not even the subtle rhythm of the ceremony that had carried everything forward until now, because the weight of what had just been acknowledged did not leave space for immediate continuation. It demanded stillness, and in that stillness, something shifted across the entire field, not in rank or position, but in understanding. Lieutenant General Marcus Whitman did not raise his voice again, did not extend the moment with explanation. He simply turned slightly, his movement controlled, and looked back toward the ceremony platform as if allowing it to resume on its own terms. But before he stepped away, his gaze returned once more to Walter Hayes, and this time, there was no distance left in it, no separation of past and present, only recognition, complete and unspoken, and he gave a small nod, not formal, not performative, just a quiet acknowledgement that carried more respect than any public gesture could have. Walter responded the same way he had from the beginning, without change, without display, his posture steady, his expression calm, as if the moment had not elevated him but simply revealed something that had always been there, and he did not step forward, did not move toward the front row or the platform, because he did not need to. The space around him had already adjusted, the line that had once separated him from the ceremony no longer holding the same meaning. Captain Ethan Cole stood where he had been, his shoulders still squared, but the certainty that had defined his actions earlier had been replaced by something quieter, something heavier, not confusion, not embarrassment, but realization, the kind that settles slowly and stays, pressing against everything it touches, and he did not speak, did not attempt to correct or explain, because there was nothing he could say that would align with what had just been revealed, and in that silence, he understood more than any instruction could have taught him, that authority without recognition is incomplete, and that not everything important appears on a list. Staff Sergeant Owen Carter exhaled slowly, the tension he had been holding releasing just enough to confirm what he had already felt, his instincts validated not by data, but by truth, and he returned. His focus to the formation, his posture firm, but his awareness sharpened, because moments like this did not happen often, and when they did, they left something behind that could not be measured. The ceremony resumed without announcement, the speaker continuing as if the pause had been part of the design, the band finding its rhythm again, the flag moving gently above them. But the atmosphere had changed, not in structure, but in depth, every word carrying a little more weight, every silence a little more meaning. And as the names continued to be read, they no longer felt like entries on a program. They felt like echoes of something larger, something that extended beyond the boundaries of the event. Walter Hayes remained where he stood, the coin still resting in his hand, unseen by most, understood by one, and that was enough. Because recognition did not need to be shared to be real, it only needed to be true. And as the ceremony moved forward, the man who had once been invisible now stood in a place that required no attention, no acknowledgement, only presence. And in that quiet presence, the entire field seemed to understand, without a single word being spoken, that some names do not need to be called often. They only need to be remembered by the right voice, at the right moment, to remind everyone else what they almost failed to see.